Hello, cyber friend. You're welcome to my class today. Today, I'll be looking at CISM Domain 2, which covers information security risk management. Like I always say, risk management is at the center of cybersecurity. And what that means is that for every time we do cybersecurity, we have to think about risk. We have to think about the importance of risk to cybersecurity and understand what it entails for us to conduct risk assessment. Today's class is going to be in two parts. First part is on information risk assessment, and I'm going to be looking at emerging risk and threat landscape. I'll look at vulnerability and control deficiency analysis, risk analysis, evaluation, and assessment. In the second part of this class, I'll be looking at information risk response. And there I'll be talking about risk treatment, risk response options, risk and control ownership, risk monitoring, and reporting. Starting with the first part of this class, talking about information risk assessment. When we hear information risk assessment, what comes to our mind? First, I'll just talk a little bit about risk management. What does risk management entail? When you think about risk management, what do you think about? I'll break it into two parts, risk and then management. I like to start by saying that in our day-to-day lives, we face risk. I mean, if you live in a house, for example, and you don't lock your door, there's already a possible risk or a potential risk by doing that. It means that there is a possibility that somebody may come into your house and take something that is not meant for them. That is what risk is about. Now, the management side of it means that what are the things you can do to manage that potential risk? Do you need to buy a new lock and begin to lock your door? Do you need to have someone to safeguard your house? Do you need to build perimeters to ensure that your house is safe and so on? So that management bit is also very important. And outside of doing all of that, continue to check monitoring. Okay, now that you are locking your doors, as it reduce the potential risk that you may face if you didn't lock your door. So that is what risk management is about, and it is crucial when it comes to cybersecurity. The foundation for effective risk management is based on a comprehensive risk assessment. You have to start by assessing the risk before you can even think of managing it. So if you don't assess the risk, how do you get to the point that you begin to manage the risk that may occur in the organization? So risk management is very crucial in organizations. When you talk about emerging risk and threat landscape, what comes to mind? Well, I'll start by saying that you need to think about defining a risk management framework. And by that, you need to define your environment, the external environment, the internal environment, which is critical. Now, talking about threats in itself, there are different types of threats that exist. We have internal threats, we have external threats, we have advanced persistent threats. And talking about identifying risk identification is the process by which the type and nature of threats are determined. So what are the types of threats that exist? So I always like to say that when you think about the word threat, what comes to your mind? It means you can exploit a vulnerability. So threat is something that can help organizations or people to exploit vulnerabilities. So when you think about threats, it's very, very important to understand that threat vulnerabilities make up risk, especially from an asset-based perspective. So what that means is that if a threat exists, the threat would look to exploit a vulnerability, and then that may lead to a potential risk or a possible risk in an organization. Vulnerabilities are like weaknesses, or they are weaknesses that exist in an environment. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give an example of a threat, a vulnerability, and how this could possibly lead to a risk in an organization. So for example, within an organization's context, there is a laptop within an organization's context in an office. Now, there is a potential threat of theft of the laptop within that office. And what are the weaknesses that may occur for that theft to occur, which is the threat? For example, it could be that where the laptop is not secure. Maybe it's not, there are poor access control mechanisms. So meaning that just anybody could walk in to that office building and steal the laptop. That's the threat. So the threat will always look for a weakness. And that is the best way to understand threat. It will always look for a weakness. Once the threat is able to see that weakness, it will be exploited and that would lead to a potential or a possible risk within the organizational environment. There are also emerging threats that exist within organization and which needs to be looked at from time to time. Talking about risk, likelihood, and impact. So let's go back to the example that I gave, that I said the laptop can be stolen, and then of course that will lead to a risk. So if you look at it, likelihood is the potential. So likelihood would look at how often does this occur? Can this occur based on incidents that has happened within the organization? And then looking at the impacts, if that laptop is stolen, for example, what does it mean to that organization? For example, if it contains sensitive information of the organization, does it mean that they are losing their information? Does it mean that data leakage may occur? Would they lose money because of the theft of that laptop, and so on and so forth? So you tie the impact to confidentiality, to integrity, and availability of information, which is very key. So when you look at all of that, you need to build it in a risk register. It is very important to have and maintain a risk register in every organization. And you use that risk register to identify risk, to assess the risk, to continue to manage and monitor the risk. At every point in time, ensuring that risk treatment options are applied on the risk and bringing it down to acceptable levels where possible. So just on my screen is an example of a risk register template. I mean, there are different risk register templates out there, lots of templates, but the most important thing is that your ability to assess risk, you should be able to assess risk in a risk register template. You must be able to identify the risk based on, if you're using a process-based approach, for example, or asset-based, being able to identify the risks that exist in the organization, ability to assess and then manage the risk. If the risk is high, for example, do you want to bring it to acceptable levels, or do you want to use other risk treatment options like transfer? There are cases where you need to transfer the risk to third parties to ensure that the risk is being managed, or avoid the risk. So there are different risk treatment options, and I will also get to that as part of this class today. So I'm going to move quickly now and talk about vulnerability and control deficiency analysis. Just like I've talked about, when you hear the word vulnerability, what comes to mind? Vulnerability is a weakness. I've said this over and over again. Just for example, in our everyday life, if somebody says, I am vulnerable, they're trying to say that they are weak. I am vulnerable, I am weak. I can be taken advantage of. It's the same thing when it comes to security. When you see that a system is vulnerable, you are trying to say that that system is weak. When you see that in an asset, there's a vulnerability, it means that there is a weakness that needs to be looked at, because if the weakness is not looked at, just as I've talked about threats, the weakness will be exploited and it will lead the organization to possible types of attacks. There are different sources of vulnerabilities out there. There's a common vulnerability exposure database that people can use to check for vulnerabilities. Also, for non-technical vulnerabilities, especially when you are looking at risks to information assets in organizations, ensuring that you use security standards and frameworks to identify the potential risks or vulnerabilities that exist. And by doing that, you're able to apply controls that can support to ensure that these vulnerabilities are looked at and treated. So what is security control baselines, or what are security control baselines? When you hear the word controls, what comes to mind? So first, I will say that controls are designed as part of risk management. And what does control entails? It could incorporate policies, standards, procedures, practices, guidelines. But the most important thing is that controls are built to ensure effective security posture in organizations. I'll give an example. So again, we are looking at the information security standard, the ISO 27001, as an example, case in point here. So if we are looking at, say, organizational controls, and there's a control called identity management and access control that organizations need to have in place. So if you look at it from the standpoint of the organization does not have a formal process to review user access periodically, there is a gap there and it is lacking. Now, to put a control in place could mean that the organization needs to develop a formal process for reviewing user access rights. That is a control that needs to be in place. And that formal process could also include reviewing privileged access too. and ensuring that on a periodic basis, say for example, every quarter, user access right is reviewed accordingly. So that is control, and that control has to be implemented. It needs to be designed to fit what the organization is looking for. It is very important. Control must also consider people, processes, and technology at every point in time. So control implementation, when you're implementing control, what are the controls that will suit at different time? What control will suit the implementation of a process? What control will suit for a technology, effectiveness of a technology, and so on? So it is very important that controls are implemented properly within the organization. There are different types of controls, but I'm just going to talk about quickly. We have preventive controls, detective, and corrective controls, and each of these controls fits into a particular part or structure within security frameworks. For example, preventive security awareness could be used as a preventive control. Why? You don't want to get to a point where um, people are downloading or installing malware into your organization's environment. As a result of that, you've built in security awareness programs to ensure that people understand what they need to do or not, so that they don't introduce malware into the environment. That's an example of a preventive control. So you must, within the organization, have different baselines at every point in time, putting into consideration that security controls must be effective within the organization. So to set control baselines, security managers can refer to standards that needs to be implemented within the organization. So for example, a security manager can say that we want to implement the ISO 27001 standard within this organization, also in alignment to the requirements of the organization or regulations that they need to meet. And then they begin to select the relevant metrics that can help them to say that this control is effective. We're able to determine the effectiveness of this control, measuring these controls from time to time, setting key performance indicators to ensure that they're able to measure the effectiveness of this control. This is very important, because if this is not done, then what they find is that there's a gap or there's a potential risk that they will need to be looking at. So it is very important that controls are measured for effectiveness. Now, again, just like we set SMART goals, when selecting controls, they can also look at SMART, ensuring that there is specific, you can measure the controls. It's attainable in terms of it being realistic. The controls are relevant, it's timely, and of course, I've put in other considerations in place for measuring controls. This is very important for the organization to get to that point in terms of having effective controls. There are different things that may affect security baselines or the controls that has been set. There are a lot of factors that could affect it, but the most important thing is from time to time, just like I have said, ensuring the measurements of this control is very important. Having baselines in place, so you have security standards, you know that at every point in time, we need as an organization to comply to this particular standard, ensuring that this is like the baseline within our organization, and what do we need to do to be sure that we are compliant to it as required. So moving on quick, I'll talk about risk analysis, evaluation, and assessment, which is very important. Within every organization, they have to go through the risk management process. This is very critical to every organization. The starting point is to identify and assess risk. Risk assessment is critical in every organization. By identifying and assessing risk, steps to take includes identifying your information assets within the organization. What are the information assets that are critical to us as an organization? When we have rightly identified these assets, we can then go ahead to identify the threats and vulnerabilities that could affect these assets within our organization. When we have identified the threats and the vulnerabilities, we can then go ahead to identify the existing controls. What are the controls that exist that could help to minimize the potential risk if this happens to be a risk? So after doing that, then we move to assessing the risk. We've done identification. Next point is to assess. Now, in assessing the risk, we are checking what is the likelihood and what is the impact. So likelihood means that frequency of occurrence or probability of occurrence. How frequent can this happen or can this occur? And then if this occurs, we are talking about impact now. If this occurs, how would it affect us as an organization? And you use that as a basis for assessment. And when you've done that, you now move to development of a plan, risk management plan. This could include development of treatment options. So at the point of treatment options, you can say this risk should be mitigated because it is above acceptable levels. So we need to bring it down to acceptable levels. So we need to apply controls. Now I've talked about security controls. What are the right controls to apply to bring this risk down to acceptable levels? There can also be cases where the best option to apply would be to transfer the risk to a third-party organization. So that at that point, we call that transfer. And then there could also be a point that the best option is to avoid the risk, and the last one is to accept. For risk acceptance, there are cases where the first step or the first approach is not to just accept risk. The first approach is not to just accept risk. And I'm saying this again. Maybe the organization needs to think about implementing controls. But if it is a case where a risk that is high needs to be accepted, then this needs to go through different level of management approval just to ensure that the acceptance is the right decision to take. And then continuous monitoring. Continue to monitor the risk. This is very important. Continually monitor the risk. A risk is low today does not mean it cannot be high tomorrow. So we need to ensure that at every point in time, we continually monitor risk, which is very important. So I'm going to move on quickly from this now. And I'll go to risk analysis, evaluation, and assessment. First point thing I'm going to talk about is determining the risk management context. Understanding the scope of risk management activities is important. What do we want to cover? There are some cases where you would say the risk assessments that we want to do, we want to focus on our information assets and assess the risk. Or we want to focus on our security processes. And by doing that, we want to use best practice standards and frameworks, for example, maybe like the ISO 27001, NIST cybersecurity framework, and so on and so forth. So understanding what we need to do, what is the context, how do we want to carry out the risk assessment? Roles and responsibilities, who should be responsible for what? At what point, who are the key stakeholders that we need for this process, for us to be able to have this process? Who are the people at the top level that would also be involved in this? Also, organizational culture. Understanding the culture of the organization. How do we define tolerance within our organization? How do we ensure that we are not going above our risk acceptable levels? If we are above the risk acceptable levels, what are the things we are doing to bring our risks back to acceptable levels? So understanding the culture of the organization is also important when determining the context of the organization. So I'm going to go to the next one, which is operational risk management. When you hear the word operational risk, what comes to mind? This is the risk of loss resulting from ineffective, inefficient, inadequate, or failed processes, people and systems, or from external events. Operational risk is also an important thing to consider when looking at security, because it could just be because of a process that a risk could occur, and you see that also in security from time to time. That is why information security focuses on people, process, and technology. Remember, a failure or weakness coming from people, failure in process, or failure in technology could impact information security within organizations. So we need to also consider the risks when it comes to operations of our security processes. What are the kind of risks that could occur? What are the incidents? If a security incident has occurred, how do we ensure that we come back from this incident or we recover from it? So this is also very important. Third one I'll talk about is risk management integration with IT lifecycle management processes. Ensuring that risk management is integrated with our IT lifecycle processes, especially when you're looking at secure development lifecycle. Integrating risk management into that process at every step by step of the phases of secure development lifecycle, ensuring that we think about and we consider risk. At the initiation phase, at the development to acquisition phase, implementation phase, operation or maintenance, and of course at disposal phase. ensuring that we identify and assess risk throughout that process. And that way, we're able to confidently say that we're able to integrate risk into the IT lifecycle management processes, which is very important in the organization. The fourth one I'll talk about is risk scenarios. Understanding these scenarios when it comes to risk, building scenarios, understanding risk factors that exist, ensuring that the number of scenarios are representative and reflect business reality and complexity is key. In some cases, using generic scenarios, for example, when I conduct risk assessments, I like to build scenarios, I like to build cases. And the reason why I do this is that it helps me to understand what is the possibility that this could be a risk or not. I like to, in some cases, also imagine. So, risk assessment is very subjective. So, you can also imagine some of these scenarios happening and building those scenarios, which is very important. And the last one I'll talk about is the risk assessment process in itself. I've mentioned this previously. You have to analyze or assess risks in organizations. Conduct risk assessment in your organization, and there are processes that are required to ensure that we conduct risk assessment. Identification of likelihood and impact is very important in assessing risk. What is the likelihood that this may occur, and what is the impact when it occurs? Example, risk. We are talking about risk assessment process now. For example, if I move into an estate and I realize that there's a likelihood that this estate is unsafe because in the past they have reported that their houses have been burgled, about 10 houses. So if we have 20 houses in the estate that I'm staying and 10 have been burgled in the space of 1 year, there's a possibility of risk in that, and that is likelihood. So if I'm assessing the risk of living in this estate now, my likelihood number is going to be high because in the space of 1 year, 10 out of 20 houses have been burgled. Now, if I want to look at the impact, when the houses were burgled, their information was stolen, their laptop was stolen, for example, their phones that carries or stores sensitive information was stolen. Other IT equipment supporting people with their day-to-day job was also stolen. So if I look at the impact and I'm now assessing the risk, I'm going to say that there's a high risk of living in this estate. If I have a friend who wants to purchase a house in this same estate, I'll tell them that the risk of living in this estate is high by my assessment. And for now, there are no controls in place. So I would advise that we need to think twice before coming to buy a house here. Risk assessment process, understanding the process is very important. This helps us to identify the kind of controls we need to put in place to mitigate identified risk. Now we have said the risk is high. What are the possible controls? We can say that, okay, maybe we need to have like police cars that will be patrolling this estate from time to time. Why? Because we want to mitigate the risks that we've identified. So the risk assessment process helps us to understand that. So still talking about risk analysis, evaluation, and assessment, there are different methodologies that you can use to assess risk. You can use the NIST methodology, for example. ISO is also a good example. I'll just touch quickly on the ISO part of it. For example, if you conduct a security gap assessment using the ISO standard, you can use it as a way to identify risk within organizations. I want to give a good example that would help you understand that better. So I'm conducting a security gap assessment and I'm looking at so the ISO standard is in 4 domains now. We have A5 organizational controls, we have A6 people controls, we have A7 fiscal controls, and we have A8 technological controls. So I'm looking at the A6 people controls, and in one of the controls it talks about information security awareness training and education. So I'm looking at that control and then I ask a question. How often do you conduct information security awareness in your organization? And the response I get is that we only conduct information security awareness when a new staff joins our organization. There is a risk in that process. Risk. Why am I saying that there is a risk in that process? People come and people leave the organization. You only conduct awareness once when people join. So if that person joined 10 years ago, that's the only time the person will do information security awareness. It means that there are risks within the organization that needs to be addressed. That's using this ISO process. Risk analysis. Risk analysis, again, I've talked about gap analysis, qualitative analysis, semi-quantitative, quantitative, and other methods. Qualitative risk analysis is one of the methods that I'm familiar with in information security. Qualitative method is very subjective. Now, I've talked about the process. So I'm just going to run through the process again for qualitative. Again, starting by, if you want to use an asset-based approach, starting by identifying your critical information assets, identifying the threats and vulnerabilities, identifying the existing controls, and from there assessing your risk using likelihood and impact. When you do that, applying your risk treatment options, 4 levels. We have accept, we have mitigate, we have avoid, and we have transfer. Now, using the 4 levels, if you are looking at mitigating, recommending controls if the risk is high, for example, after your assessment, to bring down the risk. And when you do that, you now do a reassessment. If the controls you recommended have been implemented, you will reassess the risk and reassess to see if the likelihood and impact has come down based on the implemented controls. And if that is the case, you follow a continuous monitoring process to ensure that you continually monitor the risk so that if it becomes high again, you can address it. Qualitative analysis. That's what I've just explained. Gap analysis is the other way around. I've talked about that using the ISO standard, for example. You use that, you conduct the assessment, and you bring the risk, or you identify the risk based on the assessment you've conducted, which is very important. So moving on from that, I'm going to just talk about other risk assessment approaches. I mean, apart from using the methodologies I've talked about, the risk analysis, you can also think about other risk assessment approaches. Standardized way of assessing risk, following a standardized way so that, or such that you're able to assess risks effectively. Example is the FAIR approach, factor analysis of information risk, holistic approach to risk management, and probabilistic risk assessment. So following the standardized approach helps you to assess risk using best practice. How do we ensure that we get the correct method of assessing risk and assessing it effectively? So I'm going to also quickly touch on risk evaluation. With risk evaluation, decisions are made concerning how we respond or how the organization responds to and prioritize risk. Again, risk evaluation, remember after the assessment, begin to evaluate. So there are cases where in an organization, they've assessed the risk and they find that 10 risks are now high, 6 risks they fall in the medium category. Now, they need to begin to prioritize. For example, you look at the high risk. If this risk is not looked into, or if we don't apply controls, maybe in the next 2 or 3 months, how will this affect us as an organization? So that evaluation phase, when you begin to prioritize, or you need to think about, do we need to do further analysis? Are there costs involved? What are the things we need to take into account? So that evaluation phase is very important in risk assessment. And of course, ranking risk. Who is doing what? And how do we put this risk in terms of ranking? Does this fall as high risk? Does this fall as medium risk? Does this fall as low risk? So ensuring that when we have assessed the risk, our ability to rank it accordingly is also very critical in risk management. So moving on quickly, I'll talk about the second part, which is information risk response. Although I've talked about this already as part of the first part, because I feel like when you are talking about risk, for you to gain a better understanding of it, you need to bring the second part into perspective for the first part. So risk response, once you've identified the risk, you need to begin to think about how do we respond to the risk. I've talked about it. The most common way is by applying controls. Having recommendations. So for example, I talked about no awareness. So my recommendation in that instance could be that develop an awareness program. Let's start from there. Have an awareness program in the organization using different methods. So for example, you can have screensavers, you can have monthly emails sent out, you can have quizzes that employees can take, you can have virtual awareness training maybe once every month or every quarter. Different things. You can have banners. When people come into the office building, first thing they see is a banner. If information security is very important to us, and so on. So having that recommendation to respond Why do we have it in place? We have it in place to respond to that risks that are identified when we're talking about the assessment phase. So that way, when we apply the recommendation, the point is to bring down the risk to acceptable levels, just like I've said previously. So moving on quickly from that, I've talked about risk treatment, risk response options, but again, I'm going to talk about it. We need to understand that we have to select the appropriate response to respond to a particular risk that has been identified. A risk has been identified. We have categorized the risk and we have said that this risk is high. So what is the suitable response? How do we ensure that we bring down this risk? Determining risk capacity and acceptable risk. Every organization must have a risk appetite. What is our threshold when it comes to risks? At what point can we say we are comfortable when it comes to risk? For example, I gave an example that the estates, they've borrowed 10 houses out of 20 in the estate. What is the threshold of the estate? If the estate says that we have zero tolerance for theft in this estate, then they now need to begin to think about the best method or the best way to bring down the risk. If they have zero tolerance, maybe the estate needs to be gated, for example, or maybe they need to have police coming from time to time, for example, or maybe they need to now tell everyone, you need to purchase a strong access control lock for your houses. You need to have a security camera at your entrance for every house. They make it mandatory. What are they doing? Because they have zero tolerance for risk, they are applying control. They are responding. The first thing is that they've defined the risk appetite. Our risk appetite is no tolerance. We don't want anybody to come and steal in our estate. So now, because of the risk appetite, they are responding. And how are they responding? They are applying different controls to manage the risk. There are different risk response options that I've talked about. Terminate, transfer, mitigate, accept. Terminate is the same as avoid that I talked about. Transfer. The estate in this scenario now, the estate can say that we want to hand over this activity to the police. We are now going to contract this to the police. So we're going to be paying them. They'll be on our payroll every month. So they're transferring the risk to the police. So now the police will say that we will deploy 5 of our men to secure this estate. And since this estate has said that they are going to be paying, 5 of our men will secure this estate every month. And they will be on duty. So they will patrol, they will go about, they will walk about the different streets, they would have cameras, and so on and so forth, transferring the risk. Mitigating. The estate has said that by mitigating the risk, everybody buy a new lock. There's a new lock in town that will secure your houses. There are cameras that you can put at your entrance so that when the thief is coming and they see that there's a camera, they already know that there's a potential that they will be caught eventually. Mitigating. And then, of course, accepting. The estate said we cannot accept it at this point. So when we put all those controls in place, and we now see that the risk has gone from 10 houses being burgled in a year to 0, they no longer burgle in this estate because of all the controls that we have put in place. Remember all the controls I talked about? The estate will now say, yes, this is it for us. We are ready to accept the risk, which is very important. So risk response options is very important when it comes to risk management. It is very important to respond to risk. In fact, the risk management process is not complete without the response options. Again, response can be used interchangeably with treatment, risk treatment. Risk acceptance framework. It can be a useful tool used to set the criteria for the acceptance of risk and the level at which management acceptance is executed. Meaning that what is the threshold? Remember I said that if organizations want to accept risk, it needs to be clear. What do we want to accept? Remember the example I'm giving about the estate. Estate said, no, we cannot accept this. It is too high for us. Why? Because if 10 out of 20 houses are burgled and they still have like 20 houses that they have not sold, nobody is going to come in to the new houses. Why? Because those people have heard that in this estate, they always burgle and nobody wants to live here. So the threshold has to be defined. And the threshold has to be favorable to the organization. If it is not, they stand a chance of facing different kind of impacts. Regulatory reputation, what I just talked about now in the scenario of this estate is reputation. Nobody wants to live there. If we bring this to the context of organizations, nobody wants to do business with you, because every time this organization is always facing one thing or the other because of the risk that they are accepting, which is not supposed to be, because it is above their threshold. So the criteria for the acceptance of risk must be determined by top management. Inherent and residual risk. At risk assessment, what you find is inherent risk. The risk level or the exposure without taking into account the controls that have been implemented is what you call inherent risk. So the risk after the implementation of control. So for example, the inherent risk when we talked about the estate is the likelihood that 10 houses will be burgled. So if we say from likelihood terms, we are scoring it a 5. Impact, we are scoring it a 5. The inherent risk at that point will be 25. But the moment they begin to apply controls, all the controls that we talked about, having the lock, having police, transferring and all of that, the risk that would now remain is now what we call a residual risk. So if we find that the controls are now effective and they are no longer boggling as before, then we can now say maybe likelihood is now 1, impact is now 1 or 2. The risk after implementing controls is now 2. So it has come down from 25 to 2. That is now the residual risk. Okay? Impacts. I've talked about impact a lot. Impacts are critical when it comes to risk assessment. In fact, as a result of impact, the organization may face lots of issues. Nobody wants to do business with the organization. Their risk is too high. You go to a bank and every time you hear that your money is not complete, or your money is not available for you, or you can't log into the app, you can't do any transaction. It just gets to a point in time you say, no, I can no longer do business with this bank. Their risk is too high for me. I want a bank that will give me peace of mind. Impact. That is what impact is about. Controls. I've talked about controls. Controls are used to bring down the risk. The implementation of controls will bring down the risk accordingly. So it could be a technology, it could be a process, a practice, a policy, standard, procedure that will help to reduce or mitigate the risk. And one key thing I want to say is that you need to test the control for effectiveness. Don't just say, oh, we have brought police, we are fine. No. After you brought the police into the estates, after people started buying locks and using cameras, did the theft reduce or not? You need to test it for effectiveness. Is that control working or not? If it is not effective, that risk will persist. So the implementation of control is not automatic that the risk will come down, but are the controls effective? So you have to test for effectiveness. All right. Different requirements, legal and regulatory requirements must be considered in terms of risk and impacts, so that they are able to determine, the management should be able to determine the level of compliance and priority when it comes to risk. And then organizations must consider cost. Sometimes organizations don't implement some certain controls because of costs. They'll say, the cost of the control is more than the benefits of mitigating the risk, so we cannot go ahead. It's too expensive for us. And in such cases, what you find is that the organization may decide to accept the risk because they don't want to incur additional costs that will impact their business. So these are considerations when looking at risk treatment or risk response. I'm going to move on quickly. Risk and control ownership. Sometimes there are questions around who should own the risk. From a strategic standpoint, I always like to say that the risk owner is senior management. From strategic, as a matter of fact, if a risk is high and it needs to be accepted, only the senior management should take that decision. Only, keyword, only the senior management should take that decision of accepting a high risk. You are not a senior management, you are just a junior GRC analyst, and you go ahead to accept a high risk because you want to look good to the regulators. If anything happens in that organization, that risk you went ahead to accept may cause a problem for you. So remember, keyword is only. If a risk is high and it needs to be accepted, only the senior management should accept the risk. Risk ownership is key. After a risk has been identified, please ensure that there is a risk owner. From operational perspective, ensure that there is someone who is owning up to that risk for the implementation of controls. Remember, the senior management team will not implement the controls. So from the operational perspective, there must be an owner. In your risk register, you must have an owner there that will be responsible and that will own that risk. That risk owner would also be accountable for accepting risk based on the organizational risk appetite. But remember, ultimately, the senior management holds the overall ownership for risk. And when we talk about control owner, it's the person that they've granted the authority and accountability for making control-related decisions. That's the control owner. So the person would implement those controls, own it. Again, in your risk register, don't forget, there must be a risk owner. You must have someone who is owning the risk. But ultimately, the senior management is responsible from a strategic standpoint, just like I've said, for managing the risk. And only the senior management can take those kind of decisions for accepting some kind of risk, especially if it is high. In your spreadsheets, if you have risks that are low and falls within your threshold, if your threshold or your acceptance criteria is to accept low risk, all you need to do for the risk owner at that point is to continue to monitor. Put it there that yes, we have accepted the risk, but I am the risk owner. So what I'm going to do is to continue to monitor the risk. But if a risk is high, please, going back to the previous slide, apply your risk treatment or response options. It is very important. Okay, so moving on quickly from that, risk monitoring and reporting. I've said this before, continuous monitoring. Continue to monitor. Continue to monitor the risk. Don't say a risk is low. Because the risk is low, it can never be high. No. In security, a low risk can change to become high at any point in time. So continue to monitor your risk. It is very important. Also, you need to monitor the effectiveness of your controls to be able to manage your risk. The controls we are applying, the controls we are implementing, are these controls effective or not? It is very important. Continually monitoring risk will help you to know if you need to change your approach, the type of controls you're implementing, or what are the other steps you need to take. And as part of continuous monitoring, please report risks to key decision makers in your management meetings. Let them know what the high risk are. What are the high risk? What are the low risk? What are the things we need to do to bring down the high risk? What is the status? And for effective reporting, please use visual aids. Use your charts, use your graphs, especially if you are going to management meetings. Don't go to the meetings with long sentences. Use something that can help them to understand the risk appropriately and effectively. Also, using key risk indicators as part of reporting and monitoring can be very effective. These are measures that indicate when an organization is subject to risk that exceeds a defined risk level. So there's a defined risk level. So for example, for a particular process, maybe the risk level for that process is low. And the key risk indicator is showing that there's a potential risk here because it's currently high. What we are seeing is high. Then you need to begin to say that we need to bring these risks down to the defined risk level for this particular process. So monitoring using key risk indicators is also very good. When there are changes, report changes in risk. Like I said, the risk can be low this year and it can be high the year after. It can be medium after that. So when there are changes, please report. Report to management, report to risk owners. Reporting changes in risks also helps to make timely decisions. What are the kind of decisions we would need to take when a risk has changed? Again, like I said, the fact that it is low does not mean it will be low forever. There are a lot of factors, people, process, and technology that can make risks to change from time to time. Risk communication, awareness, and consulting. For risk management to become part of an organization's culture, it is important to always communicate and create awareness. Don't say no, it is only for the InfoSec team. Everybody must understand risk within the organization. Make it a culture. Business owners, asset owners, let them understand the risks that exist. Process owners, the risks that exist in their process, risks that exist in their assets. Maybe an example, the organization does not have anything in place that helps them to classify their information. So somebody in another department does not know that when they are sending out sensitive information, they need to classify it. If the information is confidential, it should not end in the wrong hands. Create an awareness culture using risk. Communicate the importance of that classification process. Support them so that they can address the risks that has been identified accordingly. So, still talking about risk awareness. And awareness is very good in organizations, and I'm of the opinion that awareness has to be done from time to time, periodically. Why? Because a lot of risk exists in organizations, and the only way we can reduce and ensure that we continue to manage those risks is by continuous awareness. I also want to talk about documentation, which is very important in everything I've said. Having appropriate documentation is key. Your risk register. Every organization must maintain a security risk register, either by the use of tools or by using a manual approach, maybe like a spreadsheet. Organizations must maintain a risk register. It is very important. Update the risk register from time to time. Don't have just one risk register for life. What I mean is that you have one risk register that has never been updated. And if you look at it in 10 years' time, you see that same one. Update from time to time. When there are changes in people, changes in technology, changes in processes, make sure you update your register. On an annual basis, update your risk register and ensure that you continue to update. All right? Okay, so that is it for the class, but I always like to have this pop quiz in my classes. So we go through a few together and I'll end the class after this. So the first one, it says the overall objective of risk management is what? Looking at the options, the answer is to manage risk to an acceptable level. That's the overall objective. Why are we doing risk management? To bring them to acceptable levels. Remember my example, they are burgling these houses, but we want to get to a point that more people can move into this estate. Why? Because we have brought the risk to an acceptable level. More people, the only reason why more people will move to the estate is if they are confident enough that nobody will come and steal from their house. Nobody will break into their house. The overall objective is to manage risk to an acceptable level. The information security manager should treat regulatory compliance as what? The answer to this is it should be treated as another risk to be managed. Why? Why do we think this is the reason why we should treat compliance as such? Because if you look at regulatory compliance, we need to comply to this, we need to comply to that. It's just another risk we are managing so that we don't face maybe sanctions, fines, or whatever regulatory impact, for example. We are managing risk effectively by identifying the potential gaps that exist with that with all of those processes. By addressing those gaps, by implementing controls, what we are doing is we are managing risk effectively. Again, remember when I was talking about the methods or the process, you can identify your risks through gap analysis. You can identify your risks using a qualitative approach. If you are identifying through gap analysis, it could be because you are following or you are trying to achieve compliance to a standard or a framework or a regulation. So if there are risks that you've seen from there, you need to manage them. Okay, so moving on from that, next one says to address changes in risk, an effective risk management program should The answer is should ensure that continuous monitoring processes are in place. Remember what I said when I was talking about continuous monitoring? I said a risk can be low today and it will be high tomorrow. The only way you can address these changes is if there are continuous monitoring. Otherwise, if a risk is low today and you say because the risk is low, you will never assess the asset again or the process. When there are changes and the risk is high, you won't know because you are not monitoring. 5 years have passed, you didn't monitor. The risk is now high, you don't know. Case in point, flooding. There's a location that is very safe, no flood. So when you assess the risk of your office location, it's very safe, no flood. You say it's low. But in 4 years' time, the risk is no longer low. Why? Because when a bad flood happened, it affected that space. You didn't assess the risk, so you don't know. Another person moved into the organization in another 4 years. The risk is still not assessed, but that risk has changed from low to high because there has been some factors that has made it to change. So you have to continually monitor and reassess the risk to be able to address it. Okay? Indemnity agreements can be used to reduce impacts on organizational resources. These agreements serve to reduce financial impact by providing compensation for adverse events in the scope of the agreement. So indemnity agreement is very important to reduce this kind of impacts. Okay, so moving on quickly, residual risk can be determined by conducting a risk assessment. Remember when I talked about inherent and residual, I said inherent is before the implementation of controls. Residual is after the implementation of controls. The only way you can determine the residual risk is by conducting a risk assessment, not by assessing vulnerabilities or performing threat analysis or implementing risk transfer, but by conducting a risk assessment. Because before you get to residual risk, you have to first identify the inherent risk. Sometimes inherent risk and residual risk can be the same thing. Sometimes. Because from the initial assessment, in some cases, I've seen cases where from the initial assessment, the inherent risk is low and you don't need to do any other thing at that point. So when you are checking for your residual risk, it remains the same as the inherent risk. Okay? Data owners are primarily responsible for creating risk mitigation strategies to address which of the following areas? The answer is entitlement changes. Why is it entitlement changes? Because data owners are particular about who has access to their resources. So they need to be concerned with the strategy of how to mitigate risk of the data resource usage. That's what they're particular about. Data owner is the person who owns the data. So who has access to the data that they own or they are managing? So their own concern is around entitlement changes. So next question. Which of the following is the first step in selecting the appropriate controls to be implemented in a new business application? The first thing is to conduct a risk assessment. Consider the risk. The first step is risk assessment. You want to select appropriate controls. How do you select appropriate controls if you don't conduct a risk assessment? You need to conduct a risk assessment to understand the controls that needs to be implemented. So this is it for the class today. Thank you very much for watching and following. If you have any question or any comments, you can reach out to me on any of my social media platforms. Thank you very much for following the class.